はい、皆さん、こんにちは。I'm going to speak both in English and Japanese, just for I'll keep it short and I'll do it in both. このメインは多分英語なので、ぜひ皆さん、通訳の機会を手に入れてください。で、僕の頭の挨拶だけは日本語と英語両方やります。And they'll be slightly different in English and Japanese because we've been talking about this all day. But I think the key thing for the English speakers to know is that we've been having neurodiversity events for about a year, and we've been bringing practitioners. We're setting up a school, a hybrid school for kids, and we're really in the process of trying to figure out whether there's a there on the research part, and you're all part of a big experiment, and basically what I talked about earlier in the day. 日本語の方で切り替えると、Neurodiversity サロンっていう、プロジェクトでいろんな Neurodiversity に関係する人を呼んでいろんなイベントをやってきたシリーズの延長なんですけども、で Neurodiversity のこと皆さんご存知の人も結構いると思うんですけども、Diversity Inclusion みたいなフェアネスのコンテキストの中での脳の多様性もいいよねっていう話ももちろんあるんだけれども、それ以外に脳の多様性から出てくる新しいAI 時代の中のクリエイティビティのサポートの話だとか、どういう技術的なインターベンションがあるとNeurodiversity の人たちを支援できるかっていう話もたくさんあるんですけども、今回の会合の特徴としては技術を使って例えば自閉症の人たちをサポートするっていう考え方は結構今まであったんですけども、今回の Celebrating Neurodiversity って言ってるのは今までの治療だとか技術っていうのは通常健常者じゃない人たちを限りなく健常者みたいにすると。で今までの標準化された普通の人間の社会にみんなを合わせていくっていう考え方が結構多かったんですけども、最近の Neurodiversity のムーブメントの中では多様なままの方がいいじゃん、多様なままでいいじゃん、それの方がフェアだし、それの方が社会的にも価値があるし、それの方がハッピーだよねっていうので、今回のこの Celebrating Neurodiversity っていうのは Celebratory Technology っていうのがルアンさんが作った言葉で、これは補う技術だけではなくてセレブレートするっていうところで多様性を拡張する技術って面白いじゃないかなと。で世界中のこのフィールドっていうのはまだないので、世界中からいろんなリサーチャーを呼んで、社会学者だとか当事者だとかデザイナーだとか技術者とか集めて、これを本当にリサーチのフィールドとしてありなのかどうかとか、でそれを日本のコンテクストにどうやって接続するかっていう学者と当事者の会を今朝から明後日まで続けていて、で今日の午後皆さんを呼んで少しどういうような考えがあるかっていうのを披露するっていうのがここのセクションです。And then I'm just saying that, giving a little bit of background of why everybody is here, how we got here, and this is sort of a section for the Japanese audience to try to connect it into the Japanese context. 皆さんも今日いろいろ話をされた方とぜひ接続してほしいと思います。皆さんオーディエンスというよりもパティシパントとして考えていただきたいと思います。And then I guess I have the clicker. で一応今日のプロデューサーたちは私が最近学長になって千葉工大でこれはフィールドとしてあるのかっていう話と、うちのそこにいる妹がやってる Connected Learning Alliance っていう接続系の新しい学びの形なんですけども、彼女は結構ここでインクルージョンだとか学びの社会的な文脈をどうやって広げていくかっていう話で、僕らがちょっと話している中で自閉症とか Neurodiversity にこれ接続できるんじゃないかなっていうんで、ルエンとアヌシカっていう研究者を真ん中に入れて今回の会をやってみたんですね。でデジタルガレージっていうのは私が創業したここの会社が場所を提供しているっていうことで、一番最初のテンポグランデンっていうすごく有名な自閉症の当事者でもありアドボケートでもあり動物の行動科学を研究している先生で、本来彼女は来たいって言ってたんですけども来れなかったのでビデオインタビューから始めたいと思います。よろしくお願いします。
Well, I'm Temple Grandin. I am a professor of animal science at Colorado State University and a specialist in animal behavior. And I was severely autistic as a child, no speech until age 4. I knew I was autistic. The one thing that I didn't know was that my thinking was different. And I talk about that in this visual thinking book. You know, when I was building those jobs, designing those jobs, I thought that everybody was a visual thinker. And it was a shock for me when I was in my 30s to discover that other people thought in words. That was a shock. I learned that in my late 30s. But the thing is, different ways that you think bring different approaches to problem solving.
To enhance these different ways of being, we put Temple's words of wisdom into these 5 themes. She talks about awareness, acceptance, accommodation, appreciation, and advocacy. Let's begin with awareness of the autistic experience. Different approaches are crucial to the growth of a society. Here, Dr. Temple Grandin describes 3 neurodivergent thinking styles.
In autism, you can have 3 different kinds of extreme thinking styles. I'm an object visualizer. Everything I think about is a photorealistic picture. Then you have your pattern mathematical thinker, music, computer programming. So some autistics are the mathematical type, and there's others that are the art and mechanical type. And I've been very interested. Our airport at one time had a whole lot of Japanese art on display, very intricately carved. I think it might have been made by somebody who was autistic. A lot of people don't realize that Einstein was autistic. No speech until age 3.
It is important to be aware that being social for autistic people might be different from the norm. Social expectations can be confusing, overwhelming, or uncomfortable. There is an autistic spectrum of being social. Here, Dr. Temple Grandin explains her way of being social.
And I don't have complicated social relationships. Most of my social relationships are around shared interests. Well, I'm thinking about a 2-hour conversation I had on an airplane with a construction management lady, and we discussed concrete warehouse construction and concrete forming systems. That was a really, really fun flight. There's a kind of social back and forth chit chat that I just don't do, where people kind of are laughing in rhythm. It's very rapid conversation. I do not have the processor speed to follow that. What I tend to do at a party is pick out one person, we'll go talk for 15 minutes, and I've learned not to talk their head off, and then I'll talk to another person.
Neurodivergent people have sensory sensitivities, and one that can be very sensitive is tolerating lighting.
That neurodivergent people might have like sound sensitivity. Now, a sensitivity that autistic people can have, but also people with head injuries can have, is seeing flicker on LED lights. And the room will flash on and off like a strobe light. And one of the ways to find the bad lights is take slow motion video with your phone. And I had an interview last night with an architecture magazine. And I told them that the single most important accommodation inside a building is to get LED lights that do not flicker.
Neurodivergent people have learning differences. These can be in math, reading, communication, or more. Here, Dr. Grandin talks about her work with her mother to learn to read.
I did not read when I was 8 years old. I was in 3rd grade. I was not picking up sight words. So my mother taught me to read by getting a book that I really liked. It was called The Wizard of Oz. And she taught me how to sound out my words with phonics. It was all done out loud. And she'd read a page of the book, stop in a really interesting part, and then I would sound out maybe 3 or 4 words. And then gradually she read less and less, and I read more and more. And in just a few months, I went from no reading to 6th grade, or rather 12-year-old level reading. So let's try, phonetic methods, because some kids learn by sight words, dog, cat, apple. Other students learn by sounding out their words. Try both methods.
Dr. Grandin provides more suggestions for accommodating learning differences by being aware of the cognitive load of processing long sentences of spoken language. Pausing for processing and providing written instructions are something anyone can do to help.
Now, one of the places where I would have problems is I have very bad working memory. And I do not remember long strings of verbal instruction. So if there's a task with a sequence that's being presented verbally, I'm going to remember it better if I can make a checklist of the steps. It's a very simple, easy accommodation, and it would greatly help. It would also help a lot of autistic people to keep jobs. So let's say they're showing you how to clean an ice cream machine. You'd have the steps to take it apart, the steps to clean, the steps to reassemble. And we need to remind the school that for pilots on airlines, they are required to use the checklist every single flight.
Something that Dr. Temple Grandin highlights is that people feel pride when they have a job. Here she talks about celebrating neurodiversity and celebrating the accomplishments, one person at a time, really drawing attention to unique abilities of each individual.
The way to discover talent, and Michelangelo was probably autistic. Michelangelo dropped out of school at age 12, but he was exposed to great art. He was running around in all these churches that were commissioning great art. He also knew stone cutting. So that's exposure. He saw the great art, and he had the tools to make it. The only way, how can a child find out they're good at music if they don't have musical instruments? I had a little flute. I never figured out how to play it. But another child pick up that flute and just play it. Students have to be exposed to a lot of stuff. And then they can find out what they're good at. Michelangelo would not have made David if he had not had stone cutting tools as a child. We have a huge shortage, let's say, of my kind of mind to fix things like elevators. I've been on many elevators recently that I know have not been serviced. And for some, visual thinker like me, I love fixing elevators. We have broken escalators all over the airports. They're not getting fixed. These are places where, for my kind of mind, they're really good jobs. They are not going to get replaced by computers. And then you have the computer jobs, like the people who are going to figure out the next AI system. There's musicians that I know are autistic. There's famous musicians that are autistic, and they've been public about it. Elon Musk has come out that he's autistic.
By discovering neurodivergent people's strengths and then supporting careers based on those strengths, Dr. Temple Grandin illustrates a path towards celebrating neurodiversity.
Things like the auto repairs. This is one person that started it. One person started a coffee shop and hired people with disabilities, and it became a favorite neighborhood coffee shop. Or, I guess in Japan, it'd be a tea shop in Japan. But it's the same thing. I mean, these are specific examples of things that were highly successful.
In considering ever-evolving technical advancements, Dr. Grandin weighs in on the pros and cons of AI and circles back to the role of the human in the loop in artificial intelligence chatbots.
I'm very concerned about the way ChatGPT makes things up. Okay, it did a beautiful job of summarizing one of my articles on cattle handling. I asked it to do that. It did a beautiful job. But then if there's not enough data in the database that it's trained on, then it hallucinates and it makes things up.
Regarding mechanical systems that rely on artificial intelligence, Dr. Grandin reminds us of the important role of mechanics, suggesting that people who think mechanically are needed to ensure human oversight in these systems.
There's certain very important infrastructure that needs to have old-fashioned mechanical shutoffs. So that if a rogue computer tells a piece of equipment to burn up by getting too hot, to break itself by spinning too fast, or to break because it has too much pressure, big expensive infrastructure. Okay, if you run a pump dry in a waterworks, it'll wreck the pump. Well, you can put a flow meter in there, and if it stops turning, it shuts down. Old-fashioned 50s style auto shutoffs.
In terms of advocacy, Dr. Grandin's suggestion is that we make sure we're not too abstract in our actions, but we actually make it concrete and personal for the people who have power to change the laws. And here's her example.
I think a lot of the advocacy you might be doing is too abstract. One of the ways I stay out of a lot of the controversies is let's talk about that person who will make sure you don't get stuck in an elevator. And politicians in a big building can relate to that. You know, things like that, specific things that they can really relate to. You'd like to have your computer work. Well, it might be somebody with autism is going to help you keep it working.
The purpose of this video is to introduce Dr. Temple Grandin and her life experiences, as well as talk about supporting the neurodiversity movement that is occurring in Japan. To share about the culture of Japan, Dr. Joey Ito described some cultural differences between the U.S. and Japan and how new voices are emerging, such as Japan's Yuki Ichida.
You were one of the first real self-advocates that came out, and I think you moved the movement forward so much, and you're still a huge inspiration for everyone. And Japan is still very behind. As Yuki said, most people don't come out, and there is no visible self-advocate in Japan that's well known, like you were in the US and really started this whole movement. And I know Japan and the US are quite different, but I think Yuki is potentially one of the up-and-coming self-advocates who are going to be giving a voice.
Well, that's good. And that is good. I want to encourage them. Now, in my 20s, if you saw the HBO movie about me, you saw projects I designed. You know what motivated me in my 20s? I wanted to prove I was not stupid. That was a very, very big thing. Prove I was not stupid. And people thought it was weird, but nobody when I was in my 20s even knew I was autistic. You know, right now I'm old now. I'm in my 70s. And I want to encourage, the younger generation. Because the thing is, we need the skills.
Okay, that's a word from Temple. So I first wanted to introduce myself. I'm Luann Boyd from Chapman University in California and one of the 4 coordinators of this conference. And something we do here to be neurodivergence friendly is clap in a silent way. So it looks like this with 2 hands. So if you have some thoughts about that video, let me see. How'd you like it? Okay, excellent, excellent. I have some great news. I want to introduce to you a very important person that was mentioned in this, and that's going to be somebody you're hopefully going to see in Japan as a new representative for this neurodiversity movement, and he's here to share his life experience with us as well, and that is Yuki Ichida. So a round of applause for him. So this first panel, we're going to talk about self-advocacy strategies for how to manage being neurodivergent in Japan, and then we also have some speakers from Canada. They're going to share their experience with us. So if you'll take it away, here you go, Yuki.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Yuki. Today, I stand before you both as the founder of our NPO, DODEN, and as someone personally acquainted with the neurodivergent experience being an autistic and having tendencies associated with ADHD. In my childhood, I preferred reading books to chatting, and I voiced my opinions clearly. So I've been bullied for it, and this triggered my obsessive-compulsive symptoms. However, from my personal experience, I have also felt that whether my neurotype is a strength or weakness depends on the surrounding environment. For example, in my current faculty, I'm taking advantage of my neurotype. I believe that aspects of my identity, as well as my achievements in activities and research on neurodiversity, can be attributed to my strong passion and hyperactivity. This real-life experience the reason I founded DODEN, an NPO to introduce the concepts related to neurodiversity. However, through our activities on neurodiversity, I realized that most decisions regarding neurodiversity in Japan are being made without Japanese neurodivergent people. One of the barriers seems to be the linguistic one, where a bulk of the neurodiversity discourse occurs in English, putting most of Japanese neurodivergent people at a disadvantage. In Japan, most of the torchbearers for neurodiversity are not new minorities, but governmental bodies, parents, welfare workers, large corporations, and so on. While I think it is great that wide range of people are interested in neurodiversity, I also feel that their actions and perspectives based on their respective positions and viewpoints are sometimes biased. There is a concern that some of these perspectives may unconsciously lean heavily toward the medical model, potentially fostering discrimination and inequality. In addition, I feel that many Japanese neurodivergent people have unconsciously internalized these values because we are constantly encountering these narratives. I have also found that standard environment in Japan is hard for neurodivergent people. It's because Japanese society often expects one to read between the lines and to behave spontaneously just like everyone else, thereby making it difficult to embrace difference. So we endeavor to weave the principle of neurodiversity seamlessly into the daily lives of neurodivergent people, utilizing a technique called paralanguage, with the help of Professor Ibe, who is well known for his research on paralanguage. Paralanguage is a method for extracting and sharing the features common to good practice or things. We have already spent thousands of hours conducting analysis based on interviews with dozens of neurodivergent people and supporters and countless materials. We also hosted deeper discussion among Japanese neurodivergent people, nurturing an online community of neurodiversity that doubles as a self-help group, and sharing the voice of the Japanese neurodivergent community by social media. Next, I would like to emphasize the potential of information and communication technology to empower new minorities. It's because NPO's activities are completely online, which I believe fosters some kind of inclusivity and broader reach. I think that some of the audience here will be involved in the technology industry. So I want to emphasize that technology has the potential to remove obstacles in our society. Finally, let me show you some famous Japanese neurodivergent persons. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. And I wanted to remind you, you all are welcome to take pictures and share them on social media. Let's have another round of silent applause for Yuki. Thank you. Thank you very much. And then I'll need you've got the clicker. You've got the clicker? I need the clicker. Thank you so much. Okay, then I want to welcome up to the stage another pair of self-advocates and a self-advocacy agency, and that's Courtney Weaver and Rakhi Chowdhury. And they're from Canada, and they're going to share kind of their experience leading a movement around neurodiversity.
Konnichiwa, everyone. My name is Courtney Weaver. I'm a learning and development assistant for the Canadian Association for Supported Employment, or CASE. I'm also a long-standing member and project coordinator at the Autism Alliance of Canada, and more.
Hello, everyone. My name is Rakhi Chowdhury. I'm delighted to be here today and thank you for having us. I am the Communications Manager at Autism Alliance of Canada and Ready, Willing, and Able. Autism Alliance of Canada is a national nonprofit in Canada that connects the community and the government together. And I'll share a bit more a little bit later. Today's presentation is going to be short and sweet. We're going to start by talking a little bit about us. And then Courtney will share her personal journey with neurodiversity and self-advocacy, followed by a brief presentation about Autism Alliance of Canada and how we work together with the community and our learnings.
Thanks, Raki. So I live in Ottawa, a city in the Canadian province of Ontario. I am also part of a family of 5, me, my mom and dad, and 2 younger sisters, one of whom was diagnosed on the autism spectrum. I myself was diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome at 4 years old in 1997. Today, as well as being all of these things, as well as the 2 other roles I mentioned earlier, I'm also office assistant to Federal Member of Parliament Mike Lake, and also research assistant to Dr. Jonathan Weiss of York University. I'm a cross-industry assistant. Back to you, Raki.
A little bit about me. So I live in Montreal, Canada, and I've had the pleasure and the privilege to work in the neurodiversity space for the last 15 years, and I've learned so much along the way. I've worn a lot of different hats. I've started at the age of 15 volunteering, and then I worked in university and also in pre-employment programs, teaching employment skills to autistic young adults. And more recently, Courtney and I are both involved in autism policy in Canada. So again, bringing the community voices together to make change for autistic people and to connect them to the government and those who are making decisions.
Oh, thanks, Raki. So, the leaps and strides between my diagnosis and what I'm doing today is remarkable. I still sometimes pinch myself at how far I've come. There's a quote on this slide here by the actor Tom Hiddleston, which is, "You keep putting one foot in front of the other, and one day you look back and you've climbed a mountain." Well, of course, to get up a mountain, there are ledges and rocks you have to grip, climb, and reach up for in order to get to the top of it. I will tell you some of the major ledges and rocks I've had to climb in order to get to where I am today. Thank you, Raki. As I mentioned earlier, I was diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome in 1997 at 4 years old. In their efforts to give me and my sister, who was also diagnosed that same year, the best care possible, and in order to educate themselves, my parents accumulated a fairly large library of books at home. One of these books which they used in order to try to get me to understand my diagnosis is this picture book you see on here called Asperger's, Huh? Now, next slide, please. Thank you. Between 1997 and 2010, my sister and I were in a variety of therapies and also supports, all of which help to varying degrees. From Montessori-based therapy to sensory integration therapy to speech therapy to social skills, groups offered by nonprofit organizations such as Children at Risk. It's hard to think of and to pinpoint a therapy that we didn't try, at least a little bit. In 2010, in my senior year of high school, I saw the HBO film Temple Grandin, and I can't tell you how much in awe and amazed I was at it. As well as being a movie where I laughed and cried during it, it was the first time I had seen on screen a life story that reflected mine so deeply. After graduating from high school, I went to Queen's University. And while I was there, my first year sociology TA, Stephanie Cork, and the equity advisor, Heidi Penning, took an interest in me and suggested that I get involved with Disability Awareness Month events at Queen's. And so that's what I did. Every year of my 4 years as an undergraduate student, I spoke at least 1 or 2 of these events. In my final year as an undergraduate student at Queen's University, Heidi Penning suggested that I listen to this speaker, Melissa Vassallo, who was coming to campus to talk about the Critical Disability Studies graduate program at York University. I heard Melissa speak, and after hearing her talk about the program, I was inspired to apply for it. And I got in the second time that I applied. And while I was a graduate student in the Critical Disability Studies program, there were several concepts of disability that stood out to me. And those included the models and history of disability, as well as how interrelated and interconnected poverty and disability are and how each impacts the other. I also did a major research paper titled Autism and Its Associated Symbols, where I looked at 4 autism symbols in depth: the jigsaw puzzle ribbon, the puzzle piece, the umbrella, and the 3-colored children at risk rainbow. I graduated with my master's in June 2017. Work-wise, I am and have been doing autism and accessibility roles in a variety of industries over the past 10 years. My first paid work in autism was in 2013 while I was still an undergraduate student at Queen's. I had the chance to work as a summer student at the Public Health Agency of Canada. The findings that me and my colleagues did went on to form the Canadian National ASD Surveillance System, or NAS, which produced the first Canadian diagnosis rates for autism in 2018. Since then, I've had a variety of roles in the academic, federal government, and nonprofit sectors. I've also spoken at a variety of events, been interviewed, and have shared my words in a variety of news articles. So as I've had the chance to expand my network, meet absolutely incredible people, and to see and take part in a variety of initiatives, projects, and also organizations, I've also had the chance to reflect on self-advocacy, where it fits in my work, and how to constructively work with the concepts of language and colors, which can be contentious subjects in autism and disability. I am proud to be a self-advocate and to also be referred to as one. However, I don't want that label to drown out everything else about me, such as my work. And as well as being diagnosed on the autism spectrum myself, I'm also a sibling diagnosed on the autism spectrum. As for language and colors, what I've come to realize is that there's a variety of them, and no one way is going to please everyone. However, when it comes to deliverables, in order to make a case and to also make a change, and having to make a language or color choice decision, the best making the case as to why this particular making clear why this particular language or color decision was made, and acknowledging that there's more than one, is the best way to increase understanding, not division and contention between people and industries. So with that, we will go from the microcosm of my life story to the macrocosm of autism at large in Canada and the Autism Alliance of Canada.
Autism Alliance of Canada, as I was mentioning earlier, is a nonprofit in Canada. It's a pan-Canadian network with a broad and diverse membership of autistic people who are, many of them are self-advocates, their families, their support persons, as well as clinicians, researchers, people who influence policy, service providers, and organizations from across Canada. So truly anyone and everyone who shares this vision where autistic people exercise their full rights and realize their full potential. That's what we are aiming to achieve in Canada. Our mission is to inform policy and practice at a national level by bringing our members together, by identifying priority issues together, and developing meaningful ways to address them. Over the last couple of years, our organization is growing in numbers, and this number keeps growing every day. We have individuals, like I said, who joined the organization, but also organization members. Together, with all of our organization members, we are able to reach over 800,000 autistic people and their families across the country in Canada. each year we host a gathering called the Canadian Autism Leadership Summit. And this is a key initiative that really brings together everyone that I mentioned earlier. It brings together autistic people, community leaders, and decision makers, researchers, people coming together to discuss, to debate, and to talk about items to really build a more inclusive Canada for autistic people and their families. What we want to showcase is a strength in numbers, because together we strengthen our collective voice. I want to talk a little bit with Courtney about autism policy in Canada, but without going into too much detail because it's complicated. But we've made significant milestones in the last few years. One of these milestones is in 2019, the Government of Canada committed to creating a national autism strategy. The issue in Canada is that where people live, where autistic people live across the country, they access different supports. So it really matters where you live in order to access supports across the lifespan. So a national autism strategy and a commitment to this strategy is super important so that autistic people can adequately access the supports they need across their lifespan. Courtney is going to share a little bit about Bill S-203, which is another important milestone in this journey.
Oh, thanks, Raki. So earlier this year, on March 29th, 2023, Bill S-203, an act respecting a federal framework on autism, passed unanimously through the House of Commons after passing through the Senate almost a year before. As a result of it, with its passage, it's now law that whatever is the federal government of the day, Liberal, Conservative, NDP, Green, or another political party I've not mentioned already, has to develop a federal framework to support autistic Canadians, their families, and their caregivers, and it has to do certain actions in order to create an effective one, such as the Minister of Health consulting with various stakeholders such as self-advocates, support persons, and service providers, all within a certain time frame. In short, Bill S-203 is a crucial first step to ensure that the federal government will deliver on its promise for a national autism strategy.
These are some of the areas where we work together to make change happen, and where autistic people and self-advocates, community members and families are involved with researchers, with service providers to make a difference. I've listed some interesting topics here, but really they span across so many more. And here are some examples, and Courtney is going to share some examples.
Oh, thanks, Raki. So the work I've been involved in, which has touched on the 6 subject areas you have just seen in the previous slide, has resulted in these amazing outputs, such as the Autism Mental Health Literacy Project, written guide, and YouTube video series, the Housing Through an Autism Lens Challenge Brief, the Navigating Working from Home for Autistic Employees infographics and animation video, the CASE Diversity Works Research Project, and the 2018 Public Health Agency of Canada report titled Autism Spectrum Disorder Among Children and Youth in Canada. If you have any further questions on any of these deliverables, you can ask us, or you can visit the link shown here on the slide, autismalliance.ca/ourwork.
We've learned so many lessons along the way. And really at the heart of our work is inclusion, and including autistic self-advocates, including family members, community members, organizations, researchers to come together. Our work is grounded in a collective impact framework. And this framework is really meant to bring people together to impact change and to make change happen at a systems level and at a populations level. And here are some learnings that we've learned along the way. The first is grounding the work in data and context and targeting solutions. Second is focusing on systems change in addition to programs, services, and supports. Number 3 is shifting power within the collaborative, which means to have different people take leadership in different projects. Number 4, which is super important, and probably one of the most important parts here, is listening to and acting with the community and making sure that people are involved in every step of the way, especially neurodivergent folks, autistic people, their families, and so on. And finally, building equity leadership and accountability, learning from our mistakes and growing from them.
Cross-collaboration across various industries is possible, and it is necessary. For the issues they address does not just impact one autism-related population or community. It impacts them all. I've also come to a whole new level of understanding the value of persistence. And that's reflected here in this quote shown here by the writer and artist Mary Ann Radmacher, which is, "Courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes courage is the quiet voice at the end of the day saying, I will try again tomorrow." Arigatou gozaimasu, everyone.
Thank you so much. I'm going to ask you guys to stay on the stage. We have a couple minutes for questions. Yuki, if you'll join us again as well. So you've heard from Japan's self-advocate that's emerging. Come on up. And we've heard about a model from Canada that's also very successful. So we want to see how we can put these two things together, right? These guys have done a really fabulous job. We've got resources right here to do a fabulous job. How do we make this happen? What needs to happen? Where do we start? How do we do it? And we welcome your questions. And please just feel free to raise your hand and speak in any language Mimi can translate.
Come around with the mic. 日本語でもいいので、質問があれば訳しますので。Anybody want to start?
My question is a bit general question. So I want to ask, do you think individual freedom and social order are trade-off or compatible? So what I mean by that is, I do believe you should embrace neurodiversity. In other words, respect individual. But as far as I understand, which might be biased, but in the countries which value individual freedom, there seems to be a big social division. On the other hand, country like Japan, which restricts individual freedom, the social order is relatively well maintained. So do you think individual freedom and social order are trade-off and you should find a good, well-balanced point, or these two are independent and we can raise both bars? So I want to ask your opinion. I'm Satoshi Higashino. I'm from Japan.
ちょっと私がちょっと日本語でお答えさせていただきたく思います。で、個人の自由と社会の秩序の両立っていうのはまさに私がずっと取り組んできたことでもあるんですけれども、基本的に工夫次第である程度までは両立できるのではないかというふうに思っています。例えば、今この伊藤浄一さんが開催されているカンファレンスということでWeb3 だと事実分散構造というものがよく言われると思うんですけれども、それぞれの人が自律的に行動していても、でもなんというか全体としてある一つの方向に強調していくというようなことは可能だと思ってまして、例えば、経済についても、例えば一人一人の、人は勝手に自分の意思で経済活動を行っているわけですけども、全体としては市場原理というものが働いて価格が安定したりといったことが起きています。で、同じように多様性に関しても何か環境の工夫次第である程度全体としての方向性を維持しながらそれぞれが自由なことをできるし、逆にそれぞれが多様なことをしているからいろいろな可能性を 調査できて、で何かのイノベーションが生まれるかもしれないというようなこともあり得るのではないかなというふうに思っています。それともう一つは無理に一つにまとめなくても実際の社会っていうのは多分いろんなコミュニティが含まれていると思うんですよね。なので例えばある会社というものを考えたときにその会社が完全にインクルーシブでなくてもなんかそれぞれの人が自分の発達特性に合った自分が過ごしやすいような会社だとかコミュニティとかに行けるようにすると、そういった方向性もありなのかなというふうには思っています。以上でよろしいでしょうか。
Do you want to respond? I'm also happy to summarize if you didn't catch the first part of his comments. So I think the general idea, if I understand correctly, is that it's possible to work together in a society with different people and communities taking on different roles and cooperating together to elevate the social order. And even if every single organization and company is not totally inclusive to people of all neurotypes and abilities, as long as there's a place for everybody with different dispositions and backgrounds, then it brings the social order together more harmoniously. Hopefully I captured some of that. I don't know, Courtney.
I think Yuki hit the nail on the head.
Hello. Absolutely. Yuki, you had very good points. And I think one of the things, especially at our organization, is everyone has one vision and they agree on one agenda. And that makes it, everyone sort of comes together with the singular vision. And that's sort of the focus point in the movement forward. And that's what drives the movement forward.
We have time for one more question. Okay. Oh. Okay. Yeah, yeah. Please say your name and where you're from.
白川よしみです。日本人です。カナダの法律が、今回の話で通ったっていう話があったんですけど、もともとその、障害者に対する法律ってどういうものがあって、どこを改善するためにこの法案が通ったかっていう話せる範囲でいいので、もともとそのカナダにあった法律が、何が問題で今回どういう法案が通ったかっていうのを少し教えていただけたらなと思います。はい。
Did you get that in the... Okay.
Thank you for joining. So prior to Bill S-203 being passed, in 2007, the Senate in Canada published a report called Pay Now or Pay Later, which addressed service gaps throughout Canada and for autistic Canadians as well as their families and caregivers. And since then, there has been various milestones in between 2007 and 2023, such as I said, in 2018, the Public Health Agency of Canada, with its report, published the first Canadian-specific autism diagnosis rates. With Bill S-203 being passed, it is now law that the federal government of the day, as I said, whatever the political party federal government of the day is, it has to follow through on this commitment to making a federal framework for a national autism strategy. And it has to do these certain actions in this certain time frame. So that way, the hope would be is that there would be a lot less years in between the passing of this bill and the fulfillment of these actions versus the number of years that it took from the Senate publishing its report to this bill becoming law, which was almost 20 years in the making. Does that answer your question? Oh, good.
I wanted to quickly add to that if I have time. Yeah, one of the things about Canada is that the services and access to services really differs like between each province. So if you live on one side of the country versus if you lived on the other side of the country, you're not accessing the same kinds of services. And it's about education, employment, housing. So what happens is families are actually a lot of families, if they are able to, are moving from province to province when their child becomes an adult or when they reach a certain age to access those services. And that is the main issue in Canada. And so with the passing of this bill, it kind of forces the federal government to take action and take action within a very specific time frame. And so it's super exciting for Canada that this is going to happen, and it'll also really help. And the hope is that it'll really help to solve this issue across the country.
That's great. I want to wrap us up now since we're out of time, but if you'd give them a silent applause, that'd be terrific. Thank you. Thank you all so very much. That's terrific. You can go this way, and then I'd like to invite the next group up.
All right, fantastic. Thank you so much for that. Really excited to start the next panel, which will be focused on HCI and the research areas with promising compatibility with neurodiversity. So we'll be looking at a bunch of different frameworks ranging from tech inclusivity to language and communication frameworks to also various design insights. So let's kick it off with Andrew Bagel. He'll be talking more about the mission to create inclusive technology workspaces.
Great, thanks very much.
Oh.
Or
I'll
that's
start.
you. Okay, cool. Hi, everybody. I'm Andrew Bagel. I'm a professor at Carnegie Mellon University in the Software and Societal Systems Department. I need a clicker. Thank you. And back to Michelle. Let's turn it around. There we go. All right, just to kind of give a little background about myself, I went to a variety of different schools and got a PhD in computer science, but I was always really fascinated mostly by the people who use the computers more than the computers themselves. For a very long time in my career, I worked at Microsoft Research and then recently moved over to Carnegie Mellon, where I get to live out my second career. So I have a mission. My mission statement is basically to create these inclusive workplaces where everybody with people with disabilities, including also the neurodivergent, can work with and be successful at their jobs without experiencing stigma or discrimination from the people around them. So my goal here is to create the whole foundation for this inclusive technology workplace. So let's say here's a woman named Sarah. Sarah is the manager of a team in a high-tech company, and Sarah is a woman in tech, which means she's already a minority. We know that only 25% of the people in the United States in high-tech are women. Sarah's, in this particular case, is also Hispanic, which in the US is only 10% of the high-tech workforce, even though they represent a much greater part of the population in the United States. Now, Sarah knows that if she wants to build really good software for people that it includes everybody around them, you need to have a diverse set of employees to build that software for you. And she knows that in order to attract that kind of talent, you need to make sure that you have the accommodations in place to make sure those employees can work. So let's say this is Jennifer. Jennifer uses a wheelchair in her office. So Sarah makes sure that Jennifer has a workplace, a workstation that she can roll up to in order to be able to get her work done. Now, we also have Jack here. Jack is blind, and Jack is an expert at making sure that his team's software is compatible with the accessibility guidelines and, let's say, the web content accessibility guidelines that we have online, which are the things that make screen readers possible to be able to be used on websites. Now, Jack is also great because he brings the perspective of a blind person to his team, which otherwise would have no idea how to make anything accessible to other blind people as well. Now, when people get their work done in the workplace, typically they're doing individual focus work at their desk, but sometimes we change the kind of environment that we're in order to get other kinds of work done. So we might have a collaborative work that might happen in a conference room. Or sometimes we put all the software developers into the same room, we call that a team room, and everybody kind of just shouts at each other out into the air of like, oh, does anybody know the Japanese character for this particular word? And somebody will answer them. Now, sometimes we do that a little bit more scalably, like we don't necessarily shout out the answers, but we use email, or we use Slack, or we use some kind of communication tools where you're not actually having to talk out loud. that's pretty nice. We also changed the workplace a little bit also to accommodate people who couldn't necessarily be at the workplace. So even before COVID, when everybody had to go get sent home for 3 years, we had people who had situational disabilities, such as, let's say, Andrew, who had a new baby and needed to be able to work from home in order to get to maintain the role as part of their team. And so Andy is able to use remote collaboration software like Zoom or Microsoft Teams to be able to interact with his team, even though he's working from home. Now, other types of people are a different kind of challenge. So this is Jason. Jason is autistic. And Jason wants to be able to work in the workplace, but in order to get even just through the front door, Sarah knows that you need to change the kind of interview practices and the kind of workplace accommodations and interaction styles that everybody has at the workplace to accommodate people like Jason who have different ways of being, different ways of communicating than are expected by the people in the job around them. So what we then find is that even when we get Jason to come in, and our picture did not get translated, right? But the idea, this is actually one of the projects I'm working on, so that's sort of sad. But one of the things that Jason needs is Jason's easily distracted, and in an open plan workplace, all the noise and the hustle and bustle of the workplace make it hard for Jason to actually get work done. So Sarah has developed a new kind of workstation that helps insulate and protect, that protects Jason from the work around them, the people around them, so that he can actually focus on his work and get everything done. This is the kind of vision of the place that I want to create for workplaces of the future. Let's say, well, because I'm a professor, I get to think about the future and now exactly what we do now. So I have several different areas of work that I kind of try to focus on to make sure to kind of build this environment. Some of them are communication and support tools. So I'm building a tool that helps autistic and non-autistic people have conversations where they don't come away with it thinking that they hate the other person because of the differences in their communication. I also started looking at how autistic people are starting to use tools like ChatGPT to ask questions about workplace scenarios, such as, how do I make friends at work? And they're asking ChatGPT and they're getting potentially problematic answers, but they're starting to use it anyway. So we want to understand what are they doing with these tools? How do we improve that? And improve the utility of these tools to help them be more included in the workplace. Much more time? Should I wrap it up or? Okay, so other things that I'm doing, I do a lot of allyship education, and actually one of the big things here is that while we talk about the people with the labels, the ones who have autism or ADHD, by the way, I have ADHD, a lot of the work that we really want to be doing is to train neurotypical people, the non-autistic people, the people without ADHD, how to treat their colleagues with respect, how to communicate with them so that they can actually get work done, and not just to treat them as different or other. And really to address some of the stigma and discrimination that we're finding in the workplace so that we can address that and make everybody be able to work together harmoniously. So I'm going to pass it off to Justine, and we'll have to skip past a whole bunch of slides because I have a whole lot of projects, but we're just going to talk about one.
Hello. While we're waiting for this PowerPoint, let me start talking. Those of you who were here this morning heard about the kind of work that Yukiko Nakano and I do, carrying out a very close analysis of people's conversations, looking at language, nonverbal behavior, and what we call paraverbal behavior, which is things like intonation and loudness and speed of talk. In my own work, I have applied that very close analysis of conversation to supporting individuals in marginalized communities. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. Because technology, for the most part, has ignored issues of diversity or difference. It has first assumed that everybody is the same, and that same means weird. And weird these days is an acronym that stands for Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. If those people are not a member of that group, then there is something wrong with them that needs to be fixed. And a classic example, and one that I've worked on, is dialect. That is the kind of language you speak. There are many dialects in Japanese, and some are thought to be the dialects of smart people who come from wealthy families. and other dialects are thought to be what is spoken by farmers, uneducated people. The same thing is true in the United States and in France, 2 countries that I've lived in, African American Vernacular English in the US, and Verlan in France. But dialects and in general ways of speaking are not bad versions of the language. They are indexes of community and identity, and as such they are extremely important and have to be maintained and have to be a part of the technologies we build. But they are in vast majority forbidden in schools and even in workplaces, and they're not even considered in technology. But absence of these dialects can have terrible effects. This is a quote, this is actually actual writing written by a 8-year-old girl who had used a chatbot to learn with, to collaborate with. She learned more science than those children who used a chatbot that spoke the mainstream. Her chatbot spoke African American Vernacular English. Nevertheless, when she was asked, do you think Jamie, the chatbot, sounded smart? Why? If not, why not? And she said no, because she speaks ghetto. She has internalized the racism of her community. And it's not just dialect, it's also children who are deaf and whose parents are told that in order to be normal, they have to insert cochlear implants into the ears of their children, despite the fact that American Sign Language has a thriving and important community and a place to play in the construction of identity. And we see the same thing in neurodiversity. Recently, we read, and I'm happy to read things like this, the recent breakthroughs in the neurodiversity movement have triggered a call for autism research to focus on empowering autistic people and their unique communication styles instead of trying to fix them. And to me, these are all instances of dialect, of ways of speaking. However, while we need to recognize difference and support it, we also need to be truthful with ourselves and see that those who are in positions of power are those who speak the mainstream, quote unquote, normal language. And what do we do with this tension? For me, what we do is try and understand. So if we could play the video on the left, these are 2 boys who've been asked to tell a story with toys. Okay, so these are 2 boys. They've just been given toys and they're asked to tell a story. What I want you to notice is that they're talking to each other. They're looking at each other's toys and they're looking at each other's faces. And if you could hear them, which you can't really hear, you would hear that they're talking about one single story that they are co-constructing, that they're writing together. The nonverbal behavior is enough for you to see how they are collaboratively telling a story. Let's go to the next one, the one on my right.
Once upon a time, there was a girl named Goldilocks. Be careful. Suddenly, her mother says to her, be careful. Don't be lost in the backyard. She went outside to the backyard.
So you see a different style of storytelling here. The children are not looking at each other. Their prosody, that is their intonation, does not rise and fall. It's constant. And this is something we often find with individuals who are autistic. They're not looking at each other, and they are telling 2 different stories. But in other work, we've found that children from low-income families in Ireland also talk at the same time, and that they are simply better at simultaneous storytelling. So we're going to go to the next slide if we can. Come on. Oh, no, there we go. Okay. So what we wondered was whether we could compare stories told with a real child to stories told with a virtual child. You can keep playing the real child. So these are two girls who are telling a story together, and one of them has been diagnosed with Asperger's or high-functioning autism. And what you see is that she's not looking at the other girl who's telling a story, and she's not engaging. I want to show that. You can stop that video and play the other video. The other video is a girl with autism who is communicating with a virtual child.
There was a boy called Ben, and one Saturday afternoon, he was at home playing with his toy truck. Ben's grandma was sick in the hospital, and Ben wanted to play with
That's the
someone.
virtual child
So
speaking.
he called his friend Mary and asked whether she wanted to come over and play. Ring, ring. Hi, Mary. Do you want to come and play? Mary said, okay, let's bake some cookies for your grandma. They got the ingredients. Uh-huh. And a recipe book. Uh-huh. Chocolate chip cookies.
Okay, you can stop it there. So what you've seen here is that with the virtual child, the child with autism is telling a collaborative story. The virtual child is speaking more slowly, more predictably, and simply listening and saying, uh-huh. I want to end with what we've done with this, because we don't want children to spend their lives only speaking with virtual children. That's not the point. And so we wondered whether we could learn more about what's going on by giving children basically the clicker and saying, what would you do if you built a virtual child and controlled it? And this is someone sitting in a closet controlling a virtual child. They were given a panel, and they were told that they could put buttons on it for storytelling. What should storytelling look like? So let's play that video. We'll play just a
Here, we're making groups of what Sam can say. Okay. Okay. And so far in our group, we have want to make up a story together. Yeah. And okay, I'm going to start. Okay. What else goes in that group? Okay.
So the child is just beginning to use this technology.
Click it. Now click group together.
And is
Group
making
together.
groups
Right here.
for parts of a story.
So that makes a group. Yay! So what's in this group? Okay, I'm going to start. Winner, make up a story together. Wow. Okay, you want to make another group? Yeah. Okay. What should Sam say?
So we can stop that video. So what you see here is a child reflecting on what storytelling is to a listener. And this child, the second time, he was asked if he wanted to change his panel. So first, he made a panel to control, and then he controlled the virtual child while another child was interacting with it in another room. We said, do you want to change the panel? And he said, I should have used more question buttons. Can I try it again? And so this child has demonstrated that he knows that storytelling is not just speaking, but also asking questions. And it's particularly funny for this child because the first time he used the panel, one of the buttons said, want to hear a scary story? If not, tough luck, because I'm going to tell one. So this was a pretty big shift in behavior. Now, I want to point out that this interaction did not teach him storytelling in a way that involved a listener, because it wasn't long enough to teach anything. What it demonstrated was that he could switch codes from storytelling that was more centered towards his own experience to storytelling that was more centered towards a dyad. Both are okay, but one is going to make life easier in a mainstream workplace, for example. And in fact, we tested it against social stories, not a technology I'm very fond of, but still the state of the art in the United States. And we found that children who practiced storytelling with this tool later used more social interaction devices such as, what do you think? Uh-huh, tell me more. So I'm going to stop here. I just want to say that when I build technologies, and I think that when all of us in this room build technologies, the point is not to build human-like technologies, but technologies that support us in being human and humane, and understanding and exploring together these kinds of abilities is what's key. Thank you.
Hey. Hi, everybody. My name is Harthik Dinakar. I teach and research AI and clinical medicine at Mount Sinai School of Medicine in New York. In 2010, I was Joey Sensei's first student at MIT. And the first year that I got in, I took a class called Autism Theory and Technology. And I learned things by taking the class that made a lot of sense, because most of the things I was reading was almost like a replay of my childhood. I'm somebody who was nonverbal till about age 4.5. I would never tolerate shirts with labels and woolen sweaters, for instance, with tactile sensitivities. And if it wasn't for my parents, mostly my mom, I don't think I would have done anything that I've gone on to do in life. But taking the class at MIT kind of told me, in a very curious way, people, when we talk of neurodiversity, there are different kinds of nervous systems. And people who are not neurotypical have nervous systems that are very different. And that makes me very curious. Usually this translates to, as I said, sensory processing issues. So people on the spectrum, if there's overhead light, bright lights, it sometimes feels sensorily overwhelming. Some of my friends describe it as getting tickled if there's overhead light. Loud noises upsets people, sensitivities to sound, and also touch. So I'm taking this class. I'm talking to people like Professor Ross Picard, and I'm just learning about all this exciting research. And then I just look around my own lab, and it was the complete anti-pattern of what was being taught. The lighting was bad. The environment was, not very conducive for people who have much more sensitive nervous systems. So as a journey, I've learned that there are different perspectives of neurodivergence. If you talk to people in psychology and in psychiatry, they will tell you there is a concept of empath. I don't know if there's a Japanese word for an empath, but people who are emotionally very sensitive. There's also a very gastrointestinal analysis of neurodiversity. People with sensitive nervous systems usually have GI issues. In fact, one of the biggest themes at my hospital right now is, if your child is very compassionate and empathetic at a very young age, the probability that the child will have GI issues growing up is a lot higher, is what statistics shows us. So neurodiversity is everything from sensory processing to processing of emotion to how it manifests in physiology. And by studying each one of these perspectives, it can help us design things that help everybody, the general public. So like I said, while I was taking this class at MIT, I realized a lot of things had to change in our own lab. So I went to my advisor and I said, can we switch off all the overhead lights and just put warm yellow lights, for instance? I think it'll find it much more calming. Professor Cassell knows this and Joey-san knows this. Our offices were transparent with glass doors, and putting blinders, giving people privacy helped a lot. Wearing sensors like the Whoop sensor I'm wearing now, just monitoring your own heart rate variability, your galvanic skin response, very useful in saying sometimes, people on the spectrum, if there is too much interaction with too many humans, we need time to recharge our batteries, if you will, and the body basically gives you those signals. So using devices, adaptive workspaces, having quiet areas, putting fluffy toys and toys that are sensorily very calming, like squeezing balls, etc., really helps. And this is a very sensory-friendly event. Most events that I go to is pretty much an assault on the senses. It's too loud, the lighting is too intense, and there's a way in which you can design events to make sure that it's inclusive of everybody, and we did that. And others have spoken about individualized learning. My favorite example here is I told my advisor, I cannot sit opposite to you when we have our one-on-ones. I prefer to sit by your side and actually look at a monitor together. Eye contact really makes me nervous. And finally, acceptance is very empowering, and an environment where people feel that they can be who they are and they are not in any way forced to conform or normalize can be extremely empowering. And for me, that acceptance is actually what celebration means. And so how this translates very quickly in 30 seconds to my work right now, hospitals, clinical settings are pretty much a poverty of design. Virtually nothing that we do in hospitals have been done with good design. And just a very quick anecdote. I did a survey of nurses in my hospital, and I told one of the deans, some nurses, because they get anxious if plans change, are not good fit for the ER because things are always rough and tumble and changing. And in certain neurodiverse populations, something that doesn't go according to plan is very anxiety inducing. And so nurses who fall under that spectrum should probably not work in the ER. Are much happier, I think, in places like cardiology. So from lighting to devices to sounds, we can do so much learning from neurodiverse populations to make things better for everybody. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for sharing your perspectives, especially from going from inclusive technological workspaces to even frameworks of communication during work and also outside of work, and also just general design insights as well from Karthik. So thank you all. I think I want to just ask one question to the panel, and then maybe we just have one more for the audience, and then we can wrap up and move on to the next section. So one of the first important prerequisites for accessibility is awareness. So my question to you is, what kinds of ways are we able to identify and discover more neurodiverse traits to be surfaced, because, you know, Karthik was talking about empaths, which is interesting because, you know, it's a different, I think, axes of neurodiversity and traits that we can have and encompass as a human species that maybe we have not accounted for in general society. So I'm curious to all of you, what kinds of ways can we surface new traits as they come up and then allow them for them to be accessible in both work and in life. So please, if you'd like to start.
Sure. One of the cool things about the neurodiversity movement is its inclusiveness in the kinds of things that are counted as part of neurodiversity. And it's starting to include a lot of issues around mental health, depression, OCD, anxiety. And we're finding that by listening to more voices to find out the issues that are facing them, we're finding that actually there's a lot more similarities across people who are just this non-dominant neurotype than we had ever really imagined.
There, yep. I think one of the things that we can do that's important for everybody, remember that neurodiversity means everybody. All of us are a part of neurodiversity. It's difference, and we are all different from one another. And so in that light, one of the things that we can do with all of our employees and all of our colleagues is say, what are your strengths and what are your weaknesses? What are you good at and what's harder for you? And you said, let's make a space for everybody to bring all of themselves to work. I had a big sign on my door that said, you can bring all of yourself to work in this place. I think if that's not just lip service, if it's something that we share when people start working with us and we talk about it and we make space for it, then we're going to find out both the strengths and the weaknesses of the people around us and play to their strengths.
Yeah, I think from a clinical perspective, different specialties have different frameworks. So psychiatry will tell you this is what neurodivergence means in psychiatry. Clinical psychology will say maybe a different framework. The GI people will say this is a GI-centric view. I just find it very interesting how these different ways or lenses of viewing the nervous system seems to generate different insights of this is how nervous systems can be different. And all the old stuff like people who are neurodiverse have social problems, etc., is maybe reductive and not factually grounded. There's more to people with sensitive nervous systems than smiling or not smiling.
Thank you so much. Does anyone else in the question have, and anyone else in the audience have, I think we have time for just one question from the audience, so if there's any burning questions, I'd love to hear. Oh, we have one over here.
すみません。日本語で質問させていただきます。ニューロダイバーシティについて考えるときに、全員が含まれるという話がさっきあったと思うんですが、割とそのニューロダイバースな人というふうな少数派をニューロダイバースな人というふうに表現する場合もあると思っていて、それってどういうふうに、とはいえその全員がさまざまな違いを持っているというふうな理解というのはちょっとどのように理解すればいいかっていうのはちょっと自分の中で悩んでいる部分があって、ちょっと皆さんのお考えをお聞きしたいなと思って質問させていただきました。
Yeah, there's two different uses of the term. Some people refer to a neurodiverse individual as someone who differs from the so-called norm. But to my mind, that's a dangerous use of the term. And so I think about autism spectrum condition. It is a spectrum. I am on the spectrum, and so are you, and so is everyone else. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a spectrum. And for the same reason, in order to be inclusive, and because truthfully, all of us differ from one another along the lines of the traits that have traditionally been used to diagnose autism. All of us differ. So I believe that it's, to my mind, a good thing to move towards a more inclusive use of the term. But others may disagree.
So I agree with Justine about this. I'd also want to say that the neurodiversity movement itself from Judy Singer back in the 90s was a push to get people to recognize that different people, there was a notion of a minority neurotype that was not like everybody else, that when you think of everybody else, you don't think of the person who's autistic as part of that. You don't think of the person with ADHD as just like everybody else. And while there is their origins are in this notion of biodiversity, the specific idea of let's start focusing on the minorities of the population and not just thinking of everybody else as a way to promote inclusion, as a way to say, hey, you're forgetting about all these other people. Let's focus on them for a little bit. You've had thousands of years to focus on everybody else. Maybe spend a little bit of time on the autistic ones in your population, or the ones with dyslexia, or the ones with ADHD.
No, I think I agree with Professor Castle, what you said. Usually when people talk about people who are diverse, they draw the bell curve, the Gaussian bell curve, and they say people who don't fit in the norm, lie 2 standard deviations away near the edges. That's a very reductive view, and people who study mathematics and statistics, life is a lot more complex. It's a much more complex than a bell curve. So everybody's unique. Everybody's on a continuum, on a spectrum. And while certain things may apply to you, certain other things may not apply to you. But in the spirit of awareness, I think if you really ask yourself, maybe I'm an introverted person, I don't do well in crowds, but I don't have other kinds of issues. That's how your nervous system is unique. And so with that message, I think it's a lot more inclusive. And you can appreciate being different, but also at the same time, feel part of a continuum, so that you don't feel like you're isolating.
Awesome. Thank you all so much for your insights.
You have your head. So I'm the moderator, but I'm going to start a little bit with some comments. The previous conversation triggered, there was a joke site a while ago that talked about neurotypical syndrome. And they said neurotypical syndrome, there's no known cure. All you do is worry about what other people think. You don't look at the facts. You have delusions of grandeur. And I think that it's interesting also, it's actually true that there are probably no average people. Everybody has all these differences, but there's definitely a neurotypical syndrome. And Japan was called out by the UN last year for being the country that's worst about segregating people with disabilities and differences. So I think in particular, the Japanese tend to have a sort of a form, a standardized testing system, a kind of a beauty that comes from this sort of neurotypical syndrome type. And so I think we have that neurotypical syndrome issue quite a bit in Japan. So it started out as a joke, but there are actually some academic papers when you Google using neurotypical syndrome. So I wanted to point that out. And then just people are talking about their stories. So my first experience with autism was my dad. So he was quite on the spectrum. And it wasn't until I was at MIT working with people like Karthik, I think half of my students were somewhere on the spectrum. And I realized that the postdocs and the PhD students were about the age of my dad when I was having trouble with my dad. And I realized but these kids would probably be like my dad. They're trying very hard, but they're not getting it right. And so I decided to forgive my dad after all these years, a couple years ago. And I took him out and I said, Dad, I forgive you. And he said, for what? And I said, just, I forgive you. But it was a big circle for me, from going from feeling abused by my autistic dad to advising autistic students living their life. And then George Church, who's a famous researcher, said, very much like what Temple says, if it weren't for autistic people, we wouldn't have science and technology. And it's hard to raise autistic kids, actually, even for autistic parents. So people should be, who have the privilege to be able to support autistic kids, should have their fair allocation of autistic kids to raise so they can become great scientists. And one of the great interesting stories was The Beautiful Mind was a famous movie about an autistic mathematician. But there was an outcry from some of the self-advocates because it shows the person institutionalized and then becoming this famous scientist. But they said people don't go from institutions to become famous scientists. They go from privilege to become famous scientists. And in fact, we still live in a world where you can say all the things you want, but there's nothing that beats loving parents with privilege to save autistic kids. And so he said, well, you know, we were like, oh, I hope you have an autistic kid. And I did. So we ended up with an autistic girl, and when we came back to Japan, one of the key things was, what can we do to help our kid and kids like our kid? And we decided, and my colleagues are here, to make a school, and it's a hybrid school to not only help autistic kids, but kids who suffer from neurotypical syndrome. And so it includes neurotypical people, and we were pitching it to some senior people. And then one of the senior stuffy Japanese guys said, but why would normal kids' parents want to send their kids to a disability school? And I almost said, but I should have, so they don't turn into neurotypical bigots like you. And I think one of the things that we really are trying to solve in society is not, and we've had this through the course of today's conversation, is the neurotypical syndrome is actually a problem, and actually maybe part of a bigger problem than actually helping not only helping the people who are self-identify as neurodiverse, because as we pointed out, everybody is actually deep down inside neurodiverse. So I think that's a key message, and I think this is something why it's really important to understand that while there are a lot of technical things, it really is a social, cultural change, and that's why I think for us here, in addition to, and that's why the advocates, the conversation about Canada, laws are really important, but the culture is super important. And I think Japan is a very particular culture. And one of the things that I'm trying to learn is how this culture fits in with the rest of the culture to try to unlock and try to learn from the experiences that we're seeing in other countries. Anyway, so that's my little blah, blah, blah. But first, and so maybe I'll just go down, but can you share anything that you feel, but also in particular, you were working very closely with the self-advocates, which are here today, and I don't know, and around community and some of this cultural stuff, if you have anything to share.
Yes, thank you. What came to mind as you were speaking was this question about identity, and as it's coming more awareness in the Japanese culture, we had this issue. I worked at Microsoft. I worked on accessibility there for about 13 years. And we would try to design features for people who are blind or people who are low vision. But when it came to, well, what do we do for people with cognitive disabilities or who are autistic, the word neurodiverse didn't exist back then in the terminology. And we knew what to do. If you're blind, you need alternatives to vision. If you're deaf, you need captions so you can read what's being spoken. But sitting on the standards boards for like the web accessibility, we didn't know what to do for cognitive disabilities, people with learning disabilities, autism. And I think one of the turning points for our work there was that we started, instead of saying, what disability do you have? Now I'm going to design something for you. What are your functional needs that you have? When you come up to use a computer, do you need alternatives to vision? Do you need the content delivered to you in a different way? And I think that for designing for neurodiversity, we need I think that's one path through this is not are you this type of neurodiverse or that type, but what do you need the technology to do? What do you need the system overall to do? What do you need the environment to be like? It doesn't matter if it's because I have a migraine that I want the lights out, or I have a sensory sensitivity that I want the lights out, but I want the lights out. So kind of stripping away some of the identity piece is so important in working with community and understanding self-advocates and co-design with advocates is so critical. But I think also when it comes to systems design, to think about the functional needs that people have is important discussion as well.
I think you often use participatory design, and I think that's we hear about it, but I don't see it actively being used in Japan. And I think, Mimi, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about your connected learning and the work that you're doing with more inclusive learning systems in the social piece, and maybe what you've learned about maybe how it might connect to neurodiversity.
So I'm relatively new to the conversations around neurodiversity, but our community around connected learning has been working for quite some time to understand how we can support diversity in learning and interests. And it's very, in a way, connects really well to, I think, a lot of the values and orientation of the neurodiversity movement. And a lot of, the institutionalized part, like we've known for quite a long time that schools don't work for all learners, and that learning is much more not only engaging, but resilient and effective. It connects to young people's identities, their learning preferences, their interests, and that they feel a sense of inclusion and belonging, right? Rather than being forced to change in order to fit in. And, the personal story is that, Joey is also was an atypical learner. I was more of, I called myself the corporate learner because I kind of loved school and I loved all the structure and rules. But, Joey had the highest absentee rate in our high school, I think, but started the most number of student clubs. So it was very interesting to me to see an interest-driven learner of that kind. So we sort of were, embodied that diversity within our family. But one of the things that we've really learned, and I think that neurodiversity movement is kind of a, beacon for this sort of approach, is that you can't design for learners and you can't push things onto kids. Like, it has to be owned by the learners and the communities and be authentically connected to the culture and communities that people feel a sense of belonging in. And so moving away from a design orientation that is external and top-down and from one to many, to an approach that involves communities, diverse communities, voices at the table from the very beginning is really essential to how we think about connected learning and the folks who we've brought today. And so there's sort of this commonality in values, which is about, designing with communities. We all bring different expertise in the table. We're not saying that you don't need experts who are like psychologists or therapists or whatever it might be, but that it's that blending of that community and the mutual respect and the desire to kind of work together in providing different things to make a better whole. And to really meet young people or all learners where they are in their own interests and communities, I think is sort of the essential through line. And I've been really inspired by how the neurodiversity movement has really embodied those values.
Luan, do you want to, as the coiner of the phrase celebratory technology, maybe neurodiversity, do you want to talk about that, but also anything else?
Oh, sure. That sounds great. Thank you. Yeah, so the idea of what we've heard about from today and some of the bigger problems we're facing are clearly not specific to symptoms of having autism. I mean, we can treat individual symptoms. They can be things that people that don't have labels also want treatment for, and that work needs to continue. But what the biggest problem is that we haven't really addressed with technology is this social stigma around the label itself. So just having a label, if that's the biggest stigma or the biggest issue you're having, what can technology do to help with that? So the idea of celebratory technology is to change the paradigm. We have decades of research where we've built assistive technologies to help people go from deficit skills to kind of learning new skills. We have models where we try to make technology more accessible, which that work also needs to continue, where we can make somebody with a visual impairment be able to access information by changing the format of that information. We have inclusive technologies where we work on systems where people with mixed abilities can work together on the same system. So someone doesn't have to use a separate system because of a specific need, that everyone can kind of access the same kind of technologies. And so what I'd like to introduce to this group is the idea of celebratory technologies, where we take the idea of addressing the public perception of difference and disability and diversity and flip it on its head and find the things that are positive. And that's not to whitewash the difficulties. We're not saying the bad is good. There's still difficulties with there's a disabling aspects, but there's also wonderful, terrific, fantastic experiences that we want to share and get out there and celebrate. So part of our task here today is to think about how do we take this new form of technology and get it out there to help change the perceptions at large so that we can all thrive.
Yeah, that reminds me that the last Neurodiversity Salon meeting that we had, Japanese politician Seiko Noda was sharing that she was worked on the Paralympics, and she asked the advertising agency, and she said it was okay to mention it was Dentsu, which is because she was trying to go after them, that they refused to put disabled people in the commercial because people don't want to see that, and it's hard to work with them. And she forced the ads to use people with disabilities, but they turned into beautiful ads, and they were heroes, and everyone was excited. And I think there's this really interesting problem where, you know, you can actually celebrate things, and even things that are actually disabilities, the things that are difficult to celebrate, but it really depends on how you set the tone, how you set the culture. And I think that we're seeing that, at least in Japan, starting. I was talking to Yuki, though, and he was sharing with me kind of the tone on Japanese Twitter and things like that. And in the US, you know, we now see self-advocates sort of going after more conservative ways of doing treatment, for instance. But Yuki was sharing that in Japan, it's still people are still just asking for help, and that there really isn't a movement for self-advocates to go after the caregivers, because it's still, the market is still different. So I think we're in different phases of advocacy and different phases of celebration. And I think it's complicated, right? Because I think, you know, once you are in a position where you have an advocacy group, you start going after the things you want to fix. But then you have communities in Japan where we're so behind still that even just getting together is the first step. And, you know, I'm curious, and even in the same country, I think we were hearing about Canada, where you have all of these pockets where some places have a lot of support and other places don't have as much support. And I guess when we're celebrating, I'm going to sort of turn this a little bit into a question on sort of how we go forward. But I mean, I think it's nice to bring a diverse set of voices to talk, but we have very different experiences. And I don't know, and I know I see Ruha, who's probably has a lot of experience thinking about this stuff, but how do you bring these different opinions together and turn it into a neurodiversity movement, but also try to be as inclusive in the movement as possible? I don't know if you have experience or thoughts on how to do that.
First stab at that. When I heard a speaker at a neurodiversity event for a clinic in Seattle, Washington. The woman is Black and she's autistic and she has depression, and she talked about her intersecting identities and that she goes to different spaces where she is there as a representative of different communities and fighting for what she and her family need. And what she was saying is, it's the disability mantra of nothing about us without us, and it's all of me. Like, I like to say what she was saying, you know, I'm a Black, female, autistic, depressed person, and this is what me and my family need. So I think my point is that we have to embrace, like, celebrating is all of the person, and that's the bad bits, the difficult bits, the great bits, and not trying to privilege one part over the other and not leaving a part of it behind.
I think this is sort of a translation from some of the worlds that I work in, which are often focused on like racial justice and gender equity. And so not exactly the same conversations, but one of the things that because I work with scholars and practitioners and designers from lots of different disciplines that are at different levels in terms of their engagement with social justice work, for example. I mean, one of the things that is really helpful, I find, about your framework is like understanding that we may be doing slightly different things, or we may be in different lanes, but we're all on the same team in terms of the future we want to see. And as academics, that's often difficult for us because we're always like in it to win it in terms of the arguments, which is important for our careers and, you know, branding our ideas and everything. But I think what I really respect about the folks who are around the table here is people represent different voices, so it can't all be celebration and it can't all be, you know, like help in the traditional assistive sense, but you can't argue with people's lived experiences and their needs. And I feel like as a culture person, the celebratory frame is very helpful because there has to be a moment where you lift up the voices and experiences and talk about how wonderful, but but you also have to have contexts where you're not minimizing, you know, the challenges and difficulties and sort of the functional needs and all of those things. But I think those things can coexist in the same space if we recognize that it's a multi-dimensional, complex problem, and people are located in different places, and you need people to like be the critical, you know, bulldogs pointing out all the problems. You need the people celebrating the successes, but we're all on the same team at the end of the day. Ideally, I know it doesn't always work out that way, but ideally we're on the same team.
What I was hearing in your question was like kind of the range of ability and disability, and how do we, you know, when I first pitched this idea of celebrating, it was kind of like, yeah, that works for, you know, the folks that have jobs and are doing great work, and that's terrific. What about the folks that are not out there, you know, getting their PhD or their third degree? You know, how do we celebrate that? And so it's this idea that I mean, that we are so multidimensional, and we have to begin with this first level, and I think that's awareness. So we heard a lot about awareness today, just being aware of the lived experiences of other people, just understanding kind of what that situation's like. So that's something for every kind of level of ability, disability to consider. So that's work we haven't even finished doing, and a lot of us are working on that. And then there's the next layer up. To me, like the vision is once society sort of is aware of just these different ways of being, we need to get into the place of acceptance. So yeah, people can have different experiences. Lots of times, if you don't know somebody with a disability, you have no idea what that experience is. And once you become aware of it, you can start accepting, and it becomes no big deal. Like, oh yeah, that's the way they do that. What else? That's okay. So, you know, we're still at that place where that's still an agenda for us to get to this place of acceptance even. And so the question, I really got pushed by this team to kind of, when we put this conference together, like, what's next? We already do that. We're already trying to do that. What else? What is next? Where do we go? How do we push further? And so it's this idea of appreciation, to me, would be the next layer. Like, how do we go one step farther? And then that's really appreciating us as individuals, not per se that we have a label or we don't have a label, but just the idea that there is, you know, this diversity in experience, and that once we can get to understanding that, then I think we're a much more humane society.
Yeah, I mean, I would invoke Temple Grandin. She often says that if it weren't for autistic people, we would be in caves with no fire. And I've heard a lot of people say almost all geniuses are artistic. But the corollary to that, most autistic people aren't geniuses. And I think to your point, one of the problems that I see everywhere, and particularly also in Japan, is they're celebrating gifted people, right? And that leaves behind the people who aren't going to have, like you said, PhDs and things like that. And you guys picked this word, ichigo ichie, and Japanese will know what it means, but it means every meeting is unique. And it's in tea ceremony, even if you use the same utensils with the same person, every meeting has to be completely unique. And we'll do tea ceremony tomorrow. And so we think of Japan as like high form, high social cohesion with the standardization. But in fact, in Japanese and Zen, there's this idea that there's pure experience and each moment is unique. And you celebrate that uniqueness. And there is a notion in Japanese culture of this idea that you can't reduce people to numbers. And so in fact, in a spiritual sense, Japan does have the celebration of uniqueness. And so I think part of it is how to draw that out. And I think that if we're celebrating difference rather than celebrating winning, which is kind of right now very much a capitalist Western notion, I think that we can get into the right form of celebration rather than this just like, chasing after the gifted kids thing, which is what you see. I mean, and I think it's great that Elon Musk is autistic and everybody worships him, or a lot of people do. But that's not the celebration that I think we're ultimately talking about here when we talk about celebration, right?
I think part of this is self-love and acceptance, because we know that depression and rates of suicide are high in the neurodiverse communities, and that celebration is at the big societal level, and it's also within each person. And I think one thing that I've learned from my family, my neurodiverse family's experience, is to not always compare to other people of this is what family is supposed to look like, or this is what Sunday dinner is supposed to look like, but being able to let go of some of that and embrace this is what it is for our family right now today, and to feel good about that. So I like the framing because it allows for both personal reflection and then also thinking about societal acceptance. Just, I know that there's a lot of gender issues within the autism research area, from what does autism, how does it manifest in a female versus a male presenting person, and that from the very origins of what is autism, how is it diagnosed and observed, it's different in male and female, so it's underrepresented, underdiagnosed in the female population. And I think that's there's really great research in the disability studies from authors of female autistics who were late diagnosed that is really fascinating to understand their lived experiences. So it is an important dimension of the neurodiverse experience.
I would just add, part of the celebratory framework would be not just to talk about a disability or ability, but just the whole person. So all of your identity, all the pieces of it, what you like, what your favorite food is, what you hate, what your, whatever you want to disclose, what makes you you, and get back to a place where we're just connecting to people as people and not our job or our success. Like, what is that after all? Really, like, we're here, for our own journey. And I think that journey is really about learning to grow and to love each other. And so I think sharing who we are is kind of the goal. And that includes multiple intersecting identities.